Anna, my big question to you is, what do embryos mean in our society, considering that science gives us so many options today for building our families?
I'm Insoo Hyun, a bioethicist and the director of the Center for Life Sciences at the Museum of Science. Today I sat down with my co-host, Vardit Ravitsky, president of the Hastings Center in Garrison, New York. Today we talked with journalist Anna Sussman on her reporting about human embryos, in vitro fertilization, and the tough choices that sometimes we have to make in the face of these new technologies. So Anna, thank you so much for making the trip from New York City. We're now at the Hastings Center in the Hudson Valley in New York. And just really looking forward to having a conversation with you about these wonderful articles that you've written. You are a freelance journalist and you have stories in the New York Times, which you published several stories there. 3 stories in the New York Times. Could you just tell us very briefly, what do these 3 stories cover? And then we'll get into the details.
Absolutely. These are stories about the human embryo and the different ways it appears in our society today. So whether that's with IVF patients, which I think is probably what people are most familiar with, but also the research that scientists are doing around human embryos, new ways of doing genetic testing. And then recently there's been some controversial court decisions that have to do with human embryos. And so one of the articles looks at the legal status of embryos going back 20, 30 years.
Anna, I've been doing research on embryos from an ethical perspective for 30 years. And I've learned over the years that when people think about their leftover frozen embryos, they sometimes think of them as potential children, like souls on ice, somebody named it. And sometimes they think about them as just a batch of cells that has no meaning. What did you think about, what did you find out when you were writing these stories?
So part of what got me interested in this question was I was an IVF patient in the summer of 2022. You may remember that's when the Dobbs decision was issued. And that decision actually came out the morning that we were informed that we had 7 embryos, and the next day one of them would be transferred. So it was a really interesting time to learn that all of a sudden I had supernumerary or remaining embryos to think about if I didn't need them all in that particular treatment cycle. And that's really what got me interested in thinking about, well, lots of people have to face this decision. And after Dobbs, I began wondering, how does this possible elevation of the legal status of an embryo relate to IVF practice or to some of the embryo research that's happening in labs, which I believe I learned about from the Harvard Medical School bioethics conference. And, is this going to jeopardize some of that research? Is it going to change IVF practice? So I started making some phone calls to try to learn more about people doing this research or, what IVF doctors thought was going to happen. And at the time, I remember people weren't that alarmed, or at least the people who advocate on behalf of fertility patients. I think they were trying to downplay it and make sure that everyone knew that IVF was still accessible, that nothing had changed in the law. But I thought there was enough potential change or, potential ramifications of this very momentous change in abortion law to start thinking about embryos themselves and what the future of the embryo might look like in the US.
Can you take us through what it's like to work on a story? Like where does the idea come from? When you're preparing a piece for something like the New York Times, what's your process like? Do you have a big question that you start off with that you want to have answered? Do you have maybe a vague question? Tell me a little bit about your process.
In this case, it was this mix, as I said, of a kind of personal question of, okay, now I'm thinking about these things and, they have one meaning in one context. And as you said, for a lot of people, they have different meanings for different people. I think I started out wondering, how is that meaning going to change and how is practice going to change as well? Because unfortunately, because we haven't had a big sort of society-wide conversation about embryos, a lot of questions about reproduction and reproductive rights are left to the courts. So in this case, we knew that was happening at the Supreme Court level. I wanted to know more about, people who deal with embryos sort of in their daily lives, in their jobs, does this affect them and how does it affect kind of ordinary people who happen to interface with embryos? So in this case, it was just making a lot of phone calls. I mean, that's what journalists do, is just email people and set up phone calls and try to, ask questions that readers might themselves be wondering. And in this case, it was, I got enough color or string or material, whatever you want to call it, to put together a proposal about, here's the way embryos could be affected going forward. And, that led to a kind of overarching question that I began with, which is, what is the moral status of the embryo today? And then, after doing some more reading, after a few more conversations with bioethicists, people like yourself, I realized that this is a very stale question that people have been, as you said, working on for decades and decades, and that it maybe wasn't the most generative or forward-looking question, because as with abortion, I think you're never really going to get agreement. You said some people think of them as potential life. I would say a lot of people think of it as it is life. It just absolutely is a unique genetic soul or person, at that moment. Whether or not it is, it implants and becomes a live birth. I think, there's a very strong belief among some people that it already is a life and that, it has to be treated and respected as such. As you said, other people, whether or not it's their own embryos or not, they just think it's clumps of cells. And there's not a lot of discussion or dialogue between people with those different beliefs. So asking what the moral status was, I'm not sure it really leads anywhere, especially in a country like the US where there's a lot of political polarization, and there's it's a more religious country than a lot of other places where they've been able to develop more regulation and consensus around the treatment of embryos. So that the conversation kind of changed and evolved as I continued the reporting, which eventually took about 2 years. So there was a lot of evolution as the story went on.
I find it so interesting that you said some people think this and other people think that, because I found that sometimes it's the same person. So a friend of mine called me once in the middle of the night in tears. She, like you, had leftover frozen embryos, and she had this anxiety attack about her children being cold, abandoned in the freezer. Now, she already had a baby from that same batch of embryos. So emotionally, she literally felt like these are other children, genetic siblings of the baby sleeping next door, that she abandoned in the freezer. And as she was crying, she said, I know I'm crazy. I know I sound crazy. I am a rational person. I understand that they're not children, but I can't sleep and I feel guilty. And so sometimes I meet people who have those same thoughts at the same time, calling one aspect rational, another emotional. But what was it like for you? And what is it like for the people that you've explored this with?
Can I just ask what you said to her to make her feel better?
I said, so many people feel like you. You're not alone in this. You're not crazy. What you're feeling is totally normal and expected. And we're doing something with science that we've never done before. How are we supposed to have moral intuitions and emotional responses for something that is completely new to us? And that helped a little bit.
Oh, that's wonderful. I think what you've touched upon is that in some ways embryos are like mirrors. They hold up a reflection of what we're feeling at that moment, what we're thinking about. And I think in that way, they're very unique. They sort of tell you, they reflect back to you what your concerns are in that moment. So, in that she could have been falling asleep and thinking of her wonderful child who she loved so much, and her mind went there. And then, other days you get a storage bill in the mail from your clinic and you think, oof, can't I just get rid of these clumps of cells that are costing me hundreds of dollars every time I get one of these, notices? So I think for a lot of people, it really changes. It really depends on what's going on in their lives. And there's just a lot of contingency around embryos and how we think of them. There's religious factors, there's social factors, there's financial factors, there's legal factors. And I think it's really overdue having a kind of meaningful conversation about what they are and what they mean to us and how they exist across so many different contexts.
So you were working on these New York Times stories during the time in which you became a new parent, and did that experience change anything that you were planning to write, or the direction or the tone of what you were working on?
I don't have a counterfactual for that, so it's hard to know what would have changed. I think some of the things that happened that were surprising, I was at one point writing about time-lapse microscopy, which is where people can, where fertility doctors or embryologists use time-lapse photography to image the embryo as it's developing at, 2 hour, 4 hour, 8 hour, 15-minute intervals. And then they eventually speed up and condense a 5-day development process into a 2-minute video, which makes the process of cell division and look a lot more animated and lively than it actually is. And as I was reading and writing a bit about this, I wondered whether one of those videos existed for my child. So I wrote to the clinic, they sent it to me, I downloaded it, I watched it, and that was quite striking because even though I was aware that there was a bit of manipulation involved in what I was seeing, because if you watched those cells divide over 5 days, it would be a bit like watching paint dry with slightly more action. But this looked like a little dancing ball of cells, and there's a researcher who calls this unfolding in these early days the dance of life, and I thought it was a really accurate and apt metaphor because there is dancing around, it's very lively, and it was really mind-blowing, let's say, to connect that moving entity to the person who was at that point in daycare and crawling around and doing all these other things. So that was one thing. That was one experience that I don't know how it changed me or I mean, I believe it made it in the story, but it was something I hadn't expected, and it was an insight into these moments that I think visual insight that is hard to put into words, but definitely has some impact, and is also a really important example of how new technologies can change how we feel and change how we think about microscopic or biological processes.
I think a lot of us have been thinking since the Alabama court decision about what it would do to society if we thought about those entities as children, how it would block the ability to do IVF and the issues that would raise. But to me, there are so many other questions about those frozen embryos that we don't talk about, and as you said, we really should. For example, the fact that we don't know the expiration date on those entities. We know that they can be frozen for 20 plus years and then implanted, and a healthy baby will be born. What if that's possible after 100 years? What does that mean? What if the people who created them died and now somebody else wants to use them and their genetic parents are gone? Can they be inherited by my children and carried by their genetic siblings? Like a bunch of questions that are mind-blowing, that science makes possible, that I don't think we even started considering intuitively, emotionally, and our legal system hasn't really considered. So share your thoughts on all of this. It sounds science fiction, but it's possible right now.
Well, I'm curious with the posthumous embryo, the idea of a posthumous embryo donation or implantation. Does any of the practices that are coming from Israel and posthumous sperm use relate to what you might do with embryos, or is it different because it's two people? Or
for embryos, just like for posthumous use of sperm or frozen eggs, different jurisdictions around the world have very different approaches. So it really depends on the locality. But there is quite a bit of research asking people, would you like, for example, to leave your frozen embryo to your wife in the case of your tragic premature death so that she can carry your genetic child? And a lot of people say yes. And that raises issues about what is parenthood. Can you be a parent when you're no longer there just because there's genetic continuity? So these are, to me, the fascinating bioethical questions. It's maybe less about the law and what is allowed and more about why do we want to do these things? What are the ethics of doing these things?
yeah, I think those are what you're talking about also is, these aren't just speculative questions. We know that they happen all the time. And for example, I remember when posthumous sperm use was kind of a novelty. People thought, oh, that's weird. They do that in Israel because they're quite a militarized society, so the risk of death is more salient. But we've had a lot of cases here in the US. I spoke to a doctor last year who said that they've had really good luck retrieving sperm, even a couple days after the death, if it's an accident and they had to somehow wait to get the body. So it's definitely becoming something that more and more people are interested in. And I think, your question of why do people want to do this, it really comes down to human emotions, human intuitions. And I think when I was saying that embryos are a mirror, I feel like they force you to think really deeply about, why you feel the way you do. And I know in my own case, my feelings have very much shifted and evolved, often depending on what I was reading at the time or what section of this article I was working on. One thing sounded like a great idea, then all of a sudden it didn't. And then, I would read something else and I would think, oh, maybe that's a good option. And there's a lot of subjectivity that comes into play with thinking about embryos that I wanted to highlight in this piece.
But I'd like to think that there are also core fundamental values that don't change, that are part of who we are, that guide our thinking. If we really value genetic continuity, we could think, ooh, it's really cool for me to have a child when I'm no longer there. But if we value relationship and not genetics, we'd go, no, I want to be there to raise my child. It would be violating to me to have genetic offspring when I'm not around.
But if there are those core fundamental values, why do you think that people are in such disagreement about the status of the embryo?
I think because we don't share those core values. What do you think, Insoo?
That's right. I think people just have very different intuitions about whether it's a clump of cells. I know that the researchers I talk to tend to just look at it as a biological process. Even if you call it the dance of life, it's an automatic molecular sort of regular process that happens again and again. It's just amazing regularity. You talked to so many researchers, you went to some of their labs for these stories. What surprised you? What did you learn from talking to the people who work with these like day in and day out? And it's like their research and it's part of their whole professional life. What did you learn from people like that?
I was really pleasantly surprised at how thoughtful and reflective they were about that. On the one hand, you're correct. Professionally, their modus operandi way of thinking about them is these are biological processes. I just want to know what genes are operating here because I have a hypothesis, and the paper I'm planning to publish is going to focus on this transcription or this factor or whatever. But when I asked some of these bigger picture questions, a lot of them had given it a lot of thought. I think almost everyone I reached out to who's working on these processes in a lab setting replied to me immediately. They all also believed it was important to have a public conversation and a public dialogue. They wanted to be transparent. I had originally thought, and my editor and I sometimes spoke about this, aren't they scared that people who are pro-life are going to make a fuss about the work they're doing? But in fact, they believe very strongly in transparency and having the public be informed about the work that they were doing. One person mentioned being at a university and therefore being a beneficiary of taxpayer funding or public funding, and that being part of the responsibility. But I think just in general, broadly, they felt this relates to human reproduction, that something is fundamentally part of everyone's life. And whether or not you have children, you have been, reproduced yourself. And so they really wanted to bring this discussion out in the open and make it more widely known.
Anna, my big question to you is, what do embryos mean in our society, considering that science gives us so many options today for building our families? How do we think about them? How do we treat them? What are we allowed to do with them? Why are they meaningful at all?
I think this is in some ways, the question I was trying to examine over the last 2 years. And one of the things I came to at the end was just, this is a conversation we need to have in our society. And I feel that we don't have a lot of spaces or venues or places where people come together with the range of viewpoints. You could blame it on social media and the internet, but there's a lot of sort of fractured communities. And I wonder if there's a place where people can actually talk about this so that a lot of these difficult decisions aren't left to politicians who don't always have all the information they need at their fingertips, or judges who, I honestly feel bad for these judges who get these embryo disputes in divorce cases and have to reason through, what is an embryo and how do I treat it? I mean, judges have been dealing with these cases for more than 30 years, and that's got to be a thankless task to have to decide something so weighty, with all of these different moral and religious and value-laden questions attached just by yourself in your chambers, maybe with a clerk helping you. So I think it's something we all have a stake in, and my question is, where is the place for a larger conversation among different kinds of people?
There's a film that recently came out on Netflix called Joy about the first IVF baby. And it really portrays the objection of Catholic communities to this notion of artificially creating life. And remember, we used to call it test tube babies. We don't say that anymore because it has this undertone of artificial children, and we try to stay away from that terminology. In some countries today, 1 in 6 children is born from IVF. It's basically one of the most normalized and socially acceptable technologies. And yet, when it comes to those embryos that remain after the treatment is over, we're still lost for terms, lost for intuition. I find it really interesting that we're kind of lagging behind the ability to comprehend what these entities mean to us.
Why do you think that is, that 50 years later it's still an open question?
If you put it on an evolutionary scale, we've been around for many, many thousands of years, and we've never had that entity outside of the human body. So when you think about the scale of, our species, this is so new. What's 40-some years for something that was never, ever possible? We now have a gestating mother and a genetic mother. We haven't had that ever. Technology made that possible. It deconstructed the term mother. That is so powerful. It's so deep. Of course, it would take us many more years to come to terms with it.
Yeah, it was fascinating to me about the in vitro fertilization process is it took an event that happen very regularly, coital couple, fertilization event happens in the body, but now you can split up all these processes, all these steps, and have different people involved. You can have an egg donor, you can have a sperm donor, someone who gestates the child, someone who raises the child, the doctors. It's almost like when the child's born, you want to say, I want to thank all these people, my team, right, for making this happen. So it is really quite extraordinary, and all the choices that have to be made along the way, that could be made along the way, are just mind-boggling. So not only is it a new biological reality that we haven't ever seen evolutionarily, but just socially. Can you imagine? I mean, it's hard to imagine, but I think back when it first started in the late 70s, how socially disruptive it was. I think so much of the controversy was kind of around that. Like, what does it mean to be a parent? What does it mean to have a connection to your child? So were there any questions like that were sort of surprising to you as you were searching the story? People kind of have they think they kind of understand IVF by now, but was there anything that kind of stood out to you as wow, you went through the process, but also researching it, was there anything that surprised you?
I mean, I think some of the newer technologies that are being brought into the IVF process, so polygenic embryo screening is one, in vitro gametogenesis, the ability to make sperm or eggs from other cells to maintain a bodily connection. I mean, that would be the next step of kind of severing, sexual orientation or gender from reproduction, full stop. And I think that raises a whole host of interesting new questions. But the polygenic embryo screening one, you'd ask, what does it mean to be a parent? I think with IVF, at least my understanding in the history of it, when it was first brought out, it was really almost a way to reinforce some of these, parenthood, the traditional notions of parenthood. So it was for a woman and a man, usually married. They had to be married. And the whole point was to maintain that genetic continuity so that genetics and parenthood would remain all in the same family. Artificial or donor insemination goes back further than that, but it was often practiced surreptitiously. So you maintain the fiction of genetic parenthood, even if that wasn't the case in fact. But I think polygenic embryo screening, when you're selecting embryos ostensibly based on health reasons, but I think people are also selecting for other traits or interested in knowing more about other traits beyond just serious disease. So could be things like, intellectual aptitude, or I've heard height is another thing that people claim to be able to calculate risk or probability for. That's a different notion of parenthood than just, I want a baby. At that point, you're asking for a specific type of baby or possibly seeking a specific type of baby. And that's another thing I think we should be interrogating when we talk about how we treat embryos and look at embryos.
So we have here one of the world's experts on polygenic embryo screening, Vardit. And Vardit, what are some of your thoughts on this topic area?
Well, I think we haven't done enough empirical research talking to prospective parents to ask them why they're interested in this in a deep way. But some surveys showed that people are interested. They're very curious to know more about the genetics of their future child. And that always makes me smile because more than 20 years ago, I wrote my PhD dissertation about the issue of selecting, shaping the identity of your future child through genetic selection. And I compared it to education. Because you say, we shouldn't commodify our children. We should just accept them as they are. And we want to be a parent, not a parent to that child. But once they're born, think of all the things we do to make them that child. We shape their identities in a million ways. We invest so much in making them a certain way. What makes that completely okay, ethically, socially acceptable? Violin classes, competitive gymnastics, tutoring. But at the genetic level, no, this is terrible. You're, conditionally loving your child. You are a eugenicist. How do we compare and contrast genetic interventions, genetic selection, when it comes to education? So that intrigued me over 25 years ago. Before the technology allowed it, it was like a thought experiment. And hey presto, CRISPR is here. We can edit the DNA. Polygenic testing of embryos is here. We can know so much about a child that's not even in the uterus yet.
And Operation Varsity Blues is here, where people pay huge money to consultants to get their kids into a specific college.
So how do we think about parenthood in this day and age?
Well, Vardit and I both taught at Harvard, and there's so many students there who have gone through the process of being groomed to get into that school. And I think that's a wonderful comparison, genetic screening, education, because who wouldn't want the best for their child if they can afford it to quote unquote make them successful.
But as ethicists, when we're faced with the option of here are 10 embryos, I have an algorithm that tells you that this one is more likely to graduate from Harvard than that one, we cringe at the thought of implanting that one. Why? The why to me is the interesting question here.
I've heard you talk about just the downsides of a society that puts too much weight on genetics and the kind of determinism that's part of that. But I think people have I've seen a lot of articles and opinion pieces recently, but it's a thought I've had too, that so much of health is just determined by money. So, like there was just something about the secret to getting more sleep is actually just having more money, not having to stay up late worrying about your finances or having to work 2 jobs or any of the other things that make it harder to rest.
I just saw a TikTok. Well, my daughter, right?
She's not.
I have an excuse. And it was a young woman looking at the camera saying, the secret to a perfect skin is money.
Absolutely.
And being really young, I guess.
Yeah, secret to a lot of things. Longevity. I just read one of those longevity books, and the doctor who wrote it talks about all the different things he does with his patients, and it sounds really elaborate and really involved, and the kind of healthcare you would love to have, but I don't even want to know the price tag. I think with what you're talking about, when you talk about grooming your child to be a certain kind of student or accomplish something once they're born, as a parent, that just sounds like a really tedious way to parent and tedious way to interact with your child. So I think, starting with those expectations even before sounds problematic or unenjoyable too, and it kind of sets you up for a vaguely transactional relationship with your child.
Yeah, I think people might bristle naturally against some of these technologies because I think two deep core intuitions may be threatened here. One might be the deep belief in the need for more social and economic equality, less division. The gap is just getting so much larger. It's very harmful, destabilizing for society. So that's one intuition. Does this play into that? The other one is just the ideal of loving your child unconditionally, no matter what God gives you. This is your child. This is, rather than making it somewhat conditional on what you think the child will become or will be able to do. I think those two core, at least for me, those are the two kind of core values that are a little bit sort of at the edge here.
Yet, I'm bringing in another research area of mine, which is prenatal testing once the pregnancy is ongoing. In Western countries, the majority of pregnancies where the fetus has been diagnosed with Down syndrome are terminated. So parents are making an active choice to have this child and not another child. And I chose Down syndrome because it's not a disease, it's often good quality of life expectancy is much higher than it was, and yet people choose to raise this child and not another. So we're already doing it before the embryo technology, just with prenatal. We're kind of voting with prenatal testing on this notion of, I want to parent a certain kind of child. I'm not judging anybody. I'm just saying, as a society, we're already there. We're doing it. Anna, when I'm listening to you talk about what IVF is doing to reproduction and to parenthood and notions of genetic relatedness to our children, I'm thinking that IVF also separated sex from reproduction at a new level. And on one hand, heterosexual married couples want this technology in order to be genetically related to their child. They pay big money for that. Women put their bodies through a lot for that genetic link. At the same time, we bring in a sperm donor and an egg donor, pretending the genetics don't matter. And you can just build your family in another way, and the genetic link to the donor doesn't matter. It's just a donor. It's not a parent. Because that person never had the intent to parent, and we can keep them out of the equation. What does it mean to have a baby with another human being genetically when that person has no relationship with you, often is unknown to you, will never be known to you or to your child, and just pretend all of a sudden the genetics don't matter at all? So here we have an entire industry of billions built around how people value genetics. And at the same time, we have a part of that industry that tells us the genetics don't matter at all. That paradox, that contradiction has been blowing my mind for years. What's your take on this?
I think there's two things. One is, I'm not sure genetics don't matter when it comes to donors, because at least in the US, of how people select donors, they do want to know their medical history. They do want to know things that on some level they trace back to genetics. And that could be anything from they want to know the SAT scores or what college they attended, or they just like their smile and they hope that their kid, has a smile like the donor.
But Anna, from the relationship perspective, if you use a sperm donor, you may want to know medical history and educational attainment, but you have no expectation that that donor will play some role, some parental role to your child. So how do we separate reproduction from sex, reproduction from relationships? How are we able to do this mental gymnastics?
I think that goes back to this idea of how subjective all these things are, and that the meaning is what you assign to it, what you make of it. And, people who are going to use a donor, they say the most important thing is, I'm the parent and I'm going to have this relationship with my child. And I know in other countries, they don't let you choose the donor. The clinic just chooses someone who looks more or less like you. And their assumption is, you came in here, you wanted a baby. You didn't ask, we're not here to give you a tall baby or a brilliant baby. We're just, we're a fertility clinic and we're here to help you have a baby. So they choose it because they don't see the selection process as part of their job. And I believe in that case, the emphasis is on, you're going to create a relationship with this child, and that's the part that matters.
So we've been asking you a ton of questions. Do you have any questions for us?
Yeah, I was wondering, you are both professional bioethicists, and we talked earlier about intuitions and beliefs. When you think about these questions, how do you tease out what is coming from your own religious or cultural or his biological background in terms of how you were raised, and what are your sort of intellectual meanderings? How do you think about those things, and how do you separate them, if that's possible at all?
It's very difficult to do that. I'm not always sure whether I'm kind of basing my positions on the best arguments or it's kind of more other influences. I try to separate out the two, but as long as I feel that I can, whatever I believe, can defend it rationally, can give good reasons for it, and can kind of critique those reasons, I feel pretty comfortable. I don't think anybody can completely separate out other cultural influences, their own biases. You can never completely filter that out, but I think if you're vigilant, it's a process, but I think it's possible.
I totally agree. I think those biases are baked into our identity because we all come from cultures and from communities. In my case, it's very strong because I was raised Jewish Orthodox. And in Israeli society in general, the place of reproduction is central to everything in the culture. It's the country with the highest use of IVF in the world, many big families, and genetic relatedness is very important to people. And so, for example, I really rationally do not judge anyone who chooses not to have children, and emotionally, I really struggle linking or for that choice to resonate with me, because to me, that is the meaning of life. So I try to put a mirror in front of myself and try to be transparent with myself about my cultural biases and all my assumptions. And just like Insoo, if I can make a good argument that passes the rational test, I'll put it in an article. And sometimes I discover that this is who I am because of how I was raised, because of my cultural background, and I try to mitigate that because that, it doesn't pass the test of my rational critical thinking.
Is there an example of an argument you made where you got it bounced back?
So, for example, I thought for many years that there's no such thing as a woman too old to be a mother. I thought women have a right and to become mothers at any age that science can allow them to do that. We now know that a woman in her 70s gave birth in India. Women can use their own eggs later in life, and with donor eggs, we don't even know what the biological limit is. Our bodies are resilient and we can carry pregnancies very late. But I talked to a lot of psychologists and sociologists, and I learned what the impact is on children when they become orphans at a younger age. And that gave me pause. I don't think we should ban older women having babies, but I think it's a societal conversation to have about, I'm approaching 60 and my parents are alive. How fortunate am I? Whereas other kids are going to lose their parents as teens or in their 20s, and we have research that shows the impact on them. So sometimes you just want reality to be a certain way, but then you're faced with empirical facts and you have to reconsider your position.
Do people mention those arguments vis-a-vis older fathers?
Less. Interesting. Well, older fathers have always been around, so it's less of a novelty. And maybe there's a gendered assumption that kids need their moms more than their dads, which I'd love to fight as well, but what does the evidence say? So yeah, sometimes I'm all up in arms about a certain argument about reproductive autonomy and freedom, and I'm like, wait, there are people, there are relationships, there's impact on lives. Are we looking at the whole picture?
Earlier you said, Vardit, that sometimes people can have two conflicting beliefs at the same time. I think that's also true for bioethicists, and also over time you can change your own views. That happens to me, it happens to a lot of people.
I was also curious, we talked about embryos in a lot of different contexts, in IVF practice, in the lab, as a subject of judicial disputes. Do you think it's worth having some sort of conversation that links all of those things? Are those just different topics and we sort of need to have them in isolation? Or is there a definition of embryo or something we can say about them that crosses all these different areas in which they appear?
Yeah, my inclination is to keep them a little bit different, separate. I think the legal questions around embryos are very different from like personal and religious convictions about embryos. And in this country, I would like to believe that people have the freedom to believe religiously or not, culturally or not, what they think about early pre-implantation life or embryos. But where the law says, I think, should operate with giving people as much leeway, as much freedom to define for themselves the meaning of life. So I would want to keep them a little bit different. We do have a pretty standard definition biologically what an embryo is, but I don't think that will resolve all these other controversies, even if everybody agreed with that scientific definition.
So to make things interesting, I'll disagree a little bit. I disagree in the sense that we're having conversations about sperm donors and surrogate mothers and gay couples and creating gametes, a sperm and egg from body cells, and we're having all of those in isolation. I would like to see a societal conversation about the values and the meaning of all of that. What does genetic relatedness mean to us? What does parenthood mean to us? What is a family? What do we imagine when we think about having a child? Why are we scared of eugenics? Is all eugenics bad? I'd like to have these systemic, thematic conversations as a society and then see how that trickles into the different technologies and the different possibilities that science gives us. But I'm kind of tired of hearing arguments about this particular case and then completely disconnected argument about another case where at the end of the day, it's all about how do we build families and how do we create relationships that are meaningful to us. So I'd love to see a more unified, synthetic conversation about all of this.
Well, as president of the Hastings Center, I think you're very well positioned to try to enable that vision. And thank you so much for sharing your time with us and your articles. And I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you.
Today.
This has been an honor. Thank you.
Thank you.